There's a lot of innovation, both in terms of traceability, in terms of managing environmental impact and social interface and carbon footprint, which are essential for us to continue to fund and encourage and commercialize. And that's really, really important because we not only need to radically transform our industry in terms of volumes, we obviously want to radically transform our industry to prove to funders and prove to consumers that mining can be responsible. It can be low environmental impact, it can be low carbon footprint, and it can be very constructive from a social and political interface point of view.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to the State of Play in Battery Metals on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Brian Menell, CEO and Chairman at TechMet. We'll be discussing how short-term oversupply is distracting us from making the investments needed to meet the growing medium-term demand for battery metals and critical minerals, and why governments and sovereign wealth funds may need to take the lead on financing the investment that is needed. Hello, Brian. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Great to be with you, Dave.
It's great to have you here. I really enjoyed when we got to sit down together last April at the FT Commodities Global Summit 2024 in Lausanne, Switzerland. And it's great to be able to discuss the state of play in battery metals with you once again. At TechMet, you're focused on supplying critical metals for the energy transition. And when we spoke last year, you contrasted the short-term oversupply in many of these markets with the lack of investment that's currently happening and how that will likely lead to a medium-term shortage of these metals. So I thought that could be a great place to start off today and getting your sense of how are you seeing the state of these markets today?
Dave, what we discussed last year has become that much more severe with respect to the extent of short-term market weakness and the impact on growing medium-term structural shortage. So, the temporary short-term oversupply of lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth metals have continued to depress market sentiment and retard investment and delay or result in the scrapping of projects that need to be built in order to supply or meet the demand that hasn't stopped growing 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out. So the extent of that shortage of supply continues to grow every day. And the other element of these global critical mineral supply chains that is continuing, as we suggested as it would when we spoke last year, to shift is the extent of Chinese control over all of these global supply chains, because they are not slowing down their investment programs, because they have the ability or luxury or foresight to see the medium term and not be caught in short-term negative market sentiment as non-Chinese players in our industry tend to be.
And maybe you could explain, I think sometimes people find it a little counterintuitive that they want to infer that, well, if we're able to oversupply today, doesn't that mean that maybe supplying the market is easier than we thought? So why should I be worried about the medium term? What's happening there in the production process?
It's a good question, because one of the causes of the oversupply in the short term of these metals is the increase in supply that came about as a result of a speculative, excessive boom in the prices for lithium, nickel, cobalt 2.5 or 3 years ago. And the supply response to those price increases was material in terms of oversupplying a market that was going into a period of subdued sentiment anyway, but not in any way material with respect to the scale of supply growth that we need to meet demand 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years out. As the energy transition progresses and as electrification mobility continues to accelerate, and it will, we can discuss, if you want, why short-term negative sentiment is utterly irrelevant with respect to medium to long-term trends with respect to electric vehicle penetration and renewable energy growth. But the developments are such that we require 5 years out and 10 years out 5 times or 10 times the present global annual supply of a number of these metals, not 10% more. If you want to increase global production by 5% or 10% or 15%, you can tend to tweak existing operations. If you need to double and triple and quadruple, that's a 10, 15-year program of finding and developing new resources on scale. It's a completely different thing, and it's not easily achievable, even with funding support of a magnitude that is required and presently not in evidence.
And I'd love to dig into these longer term needs that you're bringing up, because I've heard you talk about this as a 20-year energy transition. So how early are we in this transition, and are we missing the big picture by focusing too much on short-term market weakness?
We certainly have to look beyond short-term market ups and downs in order to invest in and build for the medium term. And the medium term and the longer term is inescapably compelling. In 10 years' time, it's going to be very difficult to buy a diesel or petrol engine vehicle anywhere in the world, including the United States. So along the way, there are going to be accelerations and decelerations and ups and downs and many, many challenges. But the longer term direction of travel is pretty clear, and in my view, is difficult to see anything that will compromise it. Likewise, the growth of renewable energy systems as a portion of global power grids is likewise a one-way street. In 10 years' time, renewables are going to account for, many tens of percentages of higher penetration in terms of global electrical generation than it does today, with all the infrastructure and battery storage requirements that would involve. So, we really can't allow ourselves as a industry to be caught in the ups and downs of short-term sentiment, and governments and regulators have to incentivize or force us to look at the medium term. And if they don't, we and the markets and our industry will continue to fail the world. And failing the world is not just about climate change mitigation. Failing the world is about national security, countering China's aspirations on the global stage with all the implications that they involve for our values and way of life and political systems. And failure involves not adequately supplying industry in Europe and the US and elsewhere, and hence not sustaining economic growth and jobs, and radically prejudicing the stability of our societies. So, it's not just about whether what we think about climate change, is about what we think about rise of China, geopolitics, national security, and economic growth.
And I want to come back to the geopolitics and the national security issues of it all with you. But first, I wanted to ask you, because you've brought up a number of times the short-term sentiments that drive prices to extremes and then crashes. And I'm curious, is there something that you're seeing in our markets that isn't working quite right, that we might need to change, that we need to incentivize that more medium-term behavior? Or is there something in our financial markets that's making it difficult to obtain the financing for that medium-term investment that we need?
Markets have inefficiencies, and over the medium term, those inefficiencies tend to cancel out and markets work. In the short term, markets are often driven by herd mentality, inadequate information, and sentiment that feeds on itself and results in distortions and failure for markets to adequately reflect medium-term realities, which we would like them to from a global and national interest point of view. So in order to mitigate that, we do need governments and regulators And we do need imaginative leadership from our industry, from providers of capital, and from end users of our products, and from government. And they will need to be coordinated in order to ensure that short-term market inefficiencies don't sabotage medium-term national and global imperatives.
And you at TechMet have a somewhat unique perspective as a Western producer backed by the United States government, specifically the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. So I was curious, what are the challenges and opportunities you see as a Western producer in these markets?
The challenges are fairly self-evident. We are part of an industry that needs to radically transform in terms of volumes, in terms of standards, because we want to do it responsibly as a feeder of Western industry, and in terms of independence from Chinese control with all the geopolitical and national security implications that come with that. So the challenges are enormous. The opportunities likewise are enormous. The opportunities to leverage the right standard in terms of governance and transparency and the right alignment with US interests and the interests of US economic allies in terms of access to efficient funding sources from sovereign entities, be they in Washington or be they in Brussels or Tokyo and elsewhere. And in terms of investing into the supply-demand dislocation, where prices for all of our metals 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out are going to have to radically outperform most other commodities and most other asset classes in order to, over a period of time, incentivize production to eventually balance out this unstoppable growth in demand over a 5, 10, 15-year horizon.
And how are you at TechMet positioning yourself to weather these challenges and seize those opportunities?
We're a private company. We've, as you mentioned, have been fortunate to have received now 3 rounds of US government equity and investment through the DFC, the first one being in 2020 under the first Trump administration, and the follow-ons all having been under the following administration or the last administration. So we are very well positioned to accelerate our development programs and expansion of existing production across all of our 10 operating companies in alignment with US interests and the interests of US economic allies, and to leverage that position. And we are China-free in terms of sources of investments and major partnerships or counterparties, which does put us in a unique position to access what will continue to be prioritized programs across government agency to support critical mineral supply chain security. And those programs that will have to continue to evolve to compete with the United States in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris and in Seoul and in Tokyo.
And are there certain metals or areas in that space that you think might have the strongest opportunity?
We, as TechMet, focus on 7 metals or groups of metals where we see the greatest opportunity to have an impact on global supply, and where we see the most compelling supply-demand dislocation that we're at the beginning of. So we have chosen to do lithium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth metals, tin, tungsten, and vanadium, and to build across the value chain, reasonably spread across production, processing, refining, recycling, and in the case of US vanadium in Arkansas, industrial waste processing for specialty metals and metal chemicals. So, that is our positioning. It's not, we're a private, diversified, critical mineral supply chain security and industrial project development company.
It seems like the recycling aspect is kind of a growing part. I don't know how many people are aware of. I was wondering if you could just take us through that, and how much is that space growing out? I know you need a certain amount of the metal in use, obviously, before the recycling aspect becomes economically important. But how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on recycling, having funded and built Li-Cycle, and they exited and now funding and building a next generation lithium-ion battery recycling company, Momentum, in Texas, and was preparing to build our first commercial plant in Ohio. And that's specifically the recycling of black mass from lithium-ion batteries. So that's the only recycling we really know about. Obviously, recycling of other critical minerals is likewise important. But if we could just focus on lithium-ion batteries, it's the market has come a long way. There are a lot of players in the space. There are a lot of new technologies that can recycle lithium-ion batteries successfully and commercially with high recoveries. It's become a very competitive space since we first started investing and engaging in battery recycling in 2018. So it's a tough industry to compete for feedstock to build volumes from which you can generate returns. But it's possible, and it's going to happen, and it's going to be a substantial and important part of the battery metals ecosystem going forward. And in our view, in 10 years' time, recycled materials could account for up to 25% of the supply of battery metals into the manufacture of new batteries, which is very material and very important, I guess, in three ways. One is it puts value back into the supply chain and hence helps to drop the cost of batteries and increase the pace of adoption and growth. Number two, it deals with a major environmental issue because spent and damaged and end-of-life lithium-ion batteries are a big environmental pollution issue that need to be dealt with. And thirdly, it displaces reliance on Chinese-controlled supply chains from newly mined materials. So it is really important. It needs to be supported. Technologies and innovation need to be encouraged in order for it to fulfill that potential over the coming years, not only for end-of-life batteries, but in the shorter term, much more so for industrial waste, scrappage and wastage in new battery manufacturing facilities, of which there's a lot. So that's really the baseload feed of recycling for the years to come, while end-of-life batteries are starting to come into the pipeline in volume.
I wanted to return to the politics of all this. President Trump returned to the White House last week and signed a flurry of executive orders with important implications for battery metals and critical minerals. What's your understanding of the new administration's approach to battery metals and critical minerals?
I think clearly there's a big change in narrative and in prioritization. I think where there's not a big change is in the priority focus on critical mineral supply chain security, because it is a key front in the competition with China. It's a key component of national security and feeding defense industries. And it's a very key component in industrial competitiveness to fuel growth and jobs. And all of those things will continue to be very high and, in fact, increasing political imperatives and priorities. So I think while a lot of the programs, firstly, we, as I mentioned, our first equity investment into TechMet was through the DFC from US government was under Trump 1. So, a lot of what we did to define and build our strategy and our portfolio was in consultation with the then Trump administration's focus on this area. And a lot of the same people are involved, and the focus on critical mineral supply chain security and counter China and industrial protectionism and competitiveness have not gone away, they're grown. So a lot of the programs that have been evolved across numerous government departments to support this space, they might be somewhat repurposed and reprioritized, but they're not going away. They're equally as important today as they were yesterday, and they'll be even more important tomorrow.
And what would you like to see the new administration do in this space?
I think the new administration has, the vision and the ambition to do new things on a large scale and to be less beholden to precedent and bureaucracy than some previous administrations in order to be able to be bold and imaginative and change the paradigm. And critical minerals and the security of supply to US industry and domestic processing and domestic production are areas that require really bold government action in order to catalyze the scale of growth that the country and the world needs. And I think and hope that we'll see, innovative and bold moves to support our industry. And some of those will use existing tools and programs, and some of them will be new tools and new programs.
And you've talked a lot about the importance of this given China's increasing dominance across the supply chain in battery metals and vehicles. And I was wondering if you could put that in perspective. This week, of course, in an entirely different area, in the artificial intelligence area. You've had DeepSeek come out, and I think people have kind of been blown away by how innovative China is in that area, kind of unexpectedly so. But I feel like people in the manufacturing mining area have been seeing that it's almost like a different in a qualitative way what China's been able to do in this space. I was wondering if you could put that in context about when you look at what's being done by China around the world in manufacturing, in production, how good have they gotten?
They've done an extraordinarily effective job, and their performance across all of these metals in terms of primary production, processing, component manufacturing has been an extraordinary achievement. And they've been doing it over the last 15, 20 years, during which time they've built these overwhelmingly dominant position. And our metals, all of our metals are controlled 60 to 95% of global supply by Chinese interest. And that's an extraordinary achievement. I mean, some of that achievement arose out of innovation, but a lot of that achievement just arose out of the fact that everybody else was sleeping and they had cheap government money. They had lower environmental standards that allowed them to build, quicker and bigger and more competitively. They have built economies of scale, which, and all of the value of that in terms of economics and in terms of incumbency with respect to refining process technologies. So they've just done a remarkably successful, effective, and comprehensive job across all of these critical minerals.
And now the countries outside of China are, in effect, needing to play catch up. What do you think we have to learn from their success?
There's a lot one can learn about governments, regulators, financiers focusing on medium-term strategic objectives and therefore having a degree of flexibility with respect to the short-term challenges in economics to target those medium-term objectives. But that's a difficult thing for us to do. I don't think we can out-Chinese the Chinese. They operate from a very different political and economic paradigm. What we can try and do is out-innovate the Chinese and out-regulate the Chinese. And I think that's what has started in the US and Europe and has to go a very long way in order for us to succeed. And succeeding is not replacing the Chinese capacity and technologies and position that they've acquired. It's balancing it because the Chinese, they're not doing this for fun. They're doing it to have an extremely potent weapon in their arsenal, which they are starting to use and will increasingly use it two ways. One is to either threaten or act in any escalation of global diplomatic or trade conflict. And the other is clearly to advantage their domestic industry relative to the industries in the US and Europe and elsewhere in order to dominate global EV supply as they did solar cells rather than to sell lithium hydroxide to VW, which is a much less interesting thing for China Inc. to do in terms of sustaining domestic economic growth, domestic employment, domestic wealth creation, which again, from their perspective, is a political and security imperative.
And when you look around the world outside of China, whether it's the US, Europe, Australia, other countries, are there approaches you're seeing being taken now, even if they're in the early phase, that you're like, yeah, we need to be doing more of that?
There certainly are. I mean, the Australians, in terms of their funding support for domestic mining and processing, have been not inconsiderable and somewhat innovative, albeit early days. The Inflation Reduction Act and some of the bipartisan infrastructure bill programs in the States have obviously done a lot to move the dial and catalyze action in Europe, where there's a lot of initiatives, again, somewhat in their infancy, but will mature and will evolve. They are, however, all subject, unfortunately, to politics and bureaucracy, which does to an extent sabotage the scale and efficiency of their deployment, and that we have to do the best we can to minimize the impact of.
Have you seen examples where that minimization of the negative impact of politics has been effective, or is that a puzzle we're still trying to figure out?
I think it's one of the challenges of our system. And, there are places where it has been done better and places where it's been done worse, but it's never not a challenge, other than in countries that obviously, like China, who have very different systems where one can exercise top-down authority over private sector and public sector money and technologies and industrial development much more effectively. But as I previously said, we're not going to out-Chinese the Chinese. We have to out-innovate the Chinese, and we have to out-democracy the Chinese and mobilize popular will to support government action in these industries by continuing to educate people with respect to the implications of failure of critical mineral supply chain security and the imperatives of success.
Maybe switching gears, I know you recently attended the Future Minerals Forum in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I'm curious, what was the mood there, and were there any key takeaways from you from the discussions?
The mood was generally positive despite the weak present market environment. I think the industry and the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf certainly see what we see with respect to severe structural shortages medium term, imperative to scale and transform our industry, and massive consequences of failure, and obviously massive opportunities and value creation in success. So I think what the Saudis are talking about, the Qataris in Abu Dhabi, we received as TechMet very substantial investment from the QIA in our most recent funding round as the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Qatar, who've been extremely progressive and engaging and fully in alignment with our vision and our values. Likewise, what various sovereign structures, institutions in Saudi are doing in Abu Dhabi and elsewhere will become very, very important for our industry in order to fund what we need to do, which Western funding institutions are not still doing, need to do, and dabbling in it, but not anything like on the scale that's necessary. And Western state institutions are doing a lot more than they were, but again, somewhat limited and clumsy and bureaucratic, and therefore sovereign funding sources from the Gulf, will make a very big difference.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit with you, because when you think about that long-term patient money that can see the medium term, are we looking more towards the sovereign funds as potentially the important link in the capital markets relative to, say, Wall Street or the big commercial banks?
We need all of those sources of funding to do what we need to do to transform the metals and mining industry. The sovereigns are leading, and that leadership is really important and hopefully catalyzing of more funding support from big financial institutions and banks in the capitals of the world or the Western world, who continue to lag radically. And they lag radically because mining and metals historically has been perceived as being fundamentally high ESG and PR risk, and therefore best left to somebody else, namely the Chinese. Their expertise in our space has largely been denuded over the last 20, 30 years, so their ability to assess risk and value is limited, and they have limited appetites until they're incentivized or forced to do it to build that capacity and expertise. And they're generally kind of bureaucratic and conservative. So for all those reasons, we're being failed by Western financial institutions, and therefore the leadership of sovereign funding institutions in the Gulf and elsewhere is crucial.
That seems like such an important point. Sometimes Wall Street gets portrayed as the masters of the universe, but you kind of say that this resistance to taking risk or to having the knowledge and the experience to back important projects, does it really require the sovereign funds at this point to be the ones who will take the lead and, as you say, catalyze, kind of get everyone else to be the followers?
It does, and that's what's happening. Sovereign funds and government agencies in the US and elsewhere who have an enormously valuable role to play in dropping cost of capital and de-risking capital structures in order to bring in risk-averse other funding from private sector institutions.
Such a big shift. And I wanted to ask you about some of the other big shifts as we kind of try to wrap this together for our listeners, and with the idea that we need to kind of mobilize people in a democratic way. I was curious if you could kind of pull together, what are the big trends, the mega trends that the battery metals and critical minerals space is facing? And how do we need to be changing how our supply chains work so that we can meet these trends in a democratic, sustainable way while maintaining reasonable environmental standards?
There's a lot of innovation, both in terms of traceability, in terms of managing environmental impact and social interface and carbon footprint, which are essential for us to continue to fund and encourage and commercialize. And that's really, really important because we not only need to radically transform our industry in terms of volumes, we obviously want to radically transform our industry to prove to funders and prove to consumers that mining can be responsible. It can be low environmental impact, it can be low carbon footprint, and it can be very constructive from a social and political interface point of view. So all of that requires money, it requires innovation, it requires commitment, and all of that is happening. But we need to do it in a manner that's competitive, because otherwise we're not going to produce batteries and electric vehicles or anything else at a price point that is going to accelerate their adoption and growth and achieve the ends that we want. And the ends that we want are industrial growth, jobs. The ends that we want are a kind of clean, safe world. And the ends that we want are democracy and stability. All of those require what we do and require us to do it better and better and do it differently, because those objectives aren't achievable without innovation, process technology innovations, traceability innovations, component manufacturing innovations to use less of stuff that's more difficult or more expensive and more of the easily attainable and producible materials. And those are all areas where we can compete, and the United States can outcompete everywhere in terms of innovation and dynamism and imagination. And that's what we need on a bigger and bigger scale.
Thanks again to Brian Menell, CEO and Chairman at TechMet. We hope you enjoyed the episode. This concludes our series, The State of Play in Battery Metals. We'll be back next week with our new podcast series, Carbon Frontiers 2025. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.